In the previous video, we took a look at some of the different samplers that we have available in Studio One, more specifically how they compare to kind of like their Logic equivalents. Let's take a moment to talk about working with drum samples in Logic and the different options that you have. So we've always been able to use something like, for example, the sampler, where you could literally cut up samples, chop them, drag and drop them in, and you can sequence your drums using this sampler style workflow. And then this is something that was added somewhere in the version 10 life cycle. For more organic sounding drums, we have the drum kit designer. And then of course we have drum synth for if you wanted to create your own sounds, either to synthesize them entirely or to layer electronic elements underneath some acoustic drums or some samples. And then this is something that traditionally I think was kind of like linked to more electronic music and things like that, but very similar. You could drag in your different drum samples and you could work with Ultra Beat if that was something that you wanted. But as of version 10.5, I think, Logic got a pretty decent update with respect to more of an MPC style drum kit that allowed you to have multiple different samples loaded in on pads, and then you could route those to different outputs. So if we do a really quick search here, just so we can find some samples, I'm just going to start dragging some of these samples in. Now watch as I drag over here, we have the option to do quick sampler, original or optimized, drum machine, alchemy. What we want to do over here is I'm going to use the drum machine designer because this is the one that I think most closely relates Impact XT in Studio One, which is their dedicated virtual instrument for working with different drum samples. And it also integrates with their Atom and the Atom SQ very well. So the whole idea here would be that you're just dragging different samples in, and maybe we'll find a clap, something like this. Now, each one of these automatically gets routed to a MIDI channel. So starting on C1, C#1, D1. And then if we hit these different samples, we can audition them. Okay, it's a little bit loud, but that's okay. All right, so the idea here with this is you know how to use this if you're using Logic. And then one of the kind of like a really popular workflow that we have when working in Logic is that if you were to now right click, you could create a pattern region, and this will basically give you a step sequencer style workflow, which allows you to sequence kind of like a drum machine, right? You can just fill in these different steps depending on what you need. Maybe you wanted to have a 4 on the floor for your kick or something like that. And then you could add your snare in. So we could go put a snare here, put a snare here. You could have your different hi-hats, whatever you want to do. And then of course we have some other options here within velocity and note repeat. So these are things that I'm sure you're all familiar with. What I want to do is show the Studio One equivalent of this style workflow. Also worth mentioning that in Studio One version 5, we got pattern parts, and I'm pretty sure that the step sequencer regions, the pattern regions in Logic, were probably largely inspired from the pattern parts in Studio One, and also anybody coming from FL Studio would probably have the same style of workflow as well. So let's hop over to Studio One. I have a session over here. I was just kind of noodling around after we laid down that synth progression. But what I want to do is actually, I just want to start from scratch. So I'm going to take all of this over here. I'm just going to hide this all and make it inactive. We're going to start from scratch. I'm going to open up the browser. We'll go to the Instruments tab. And then within the Instruments, if I go to the Personas folder, I'm going to just drag and drop an instance of Impact over here. This will automatically create this virtual instrument for me. All right. So if you're prescribing or subscribing to Personas Sphere, there's a lot of kits that are coming out on a monthly basis. And also Studio One ships with sound sets, even if you have a perpetual license, where you can have lots of different options for lots of different presets based on genre and the styles of music that you want. For this case, I'm going to go with something simple. It's actually something that I've made, and I'm just going to load a basic 808 kit. So when I load this preset now, okay, this is just a really, really basic instrument that I've created, and it just gives you a really good understanding of what we can do. So one cool thing about this is that we have some different colors that we can assign to the pads. Basically, just by clicking any one of these, you could come up here to the corner. So for example, if I wanted these both to be like, let's say a green color, then I could just click each one of these and I could make these green. These don't have anything loaded on them right now. If you want no color, you would just click this little box. But the other cool thing is if you're using an Atom or an Atom SQ, all of these pads and these colors, they will actually match the hardware so that you can have a clear indication of where your kick and where your snares and hi-hats and all of your different samples are loaded on these individual pads. If you're used to working with samplers, like I said, there's a lot of stuff that's going to be just common sense. So we have an amp setting over here. I can adjust the gain. We have a pan. Each one of these can be adjusted individually just by clicking. You'll see that these values are changing based on what you're doing. A couple tips though that I want to share is for things like you have different elements that are grouped together. A really good example of this would be, for example, for hi-hats. When you're working with hi-hats, it's very easy to just assign a choke group to the hi-hats. This is something that, you could also say, okay, maybe I want to do this on the toms as well. You could hold down the control key or command key on a Mac, or that'll be control on a PC. We could select these 3 pads and we could assign these all to choke group 2. So now anytime you have one of these pads being triggered, it's going to cancel out the previous sample that's being loaded. Very easy to load samples. We can right click and we can add a sample. We can replace a sample. We can clear the pad. We can also load directly from the Files tab if you wanted to navigate to some samples over here. So I'm going to go to Macintosh HD and I can just type in Lin. So we can get those same Lindrum samples that we had that were coming from Logic over here. You can play this one over here. All you have to do, literally, just drag and drop it right across to here. If I wanted to have something like a snare, just drag and drop it. That's been loaded. If I wanted to clear the pad, very easy, just clear the pad. If I wanted to replace a sample, I can click the replace sample. It's going to bring me to the Finder window. So very, very easy to be able to just work with this in terms of, especially if you have any previous understanding of working with samplers. Now, in terms of the different modes that we have, not only do we have the ability to load individual one-shots over here, but we could also load loops. So what I'm going to do right now is let's go to Studio One, and we can actually go to the sound sets over here if we wanted. And let's see what we have here. We've got construction kits. We have some different loops. So this is a full kit. It's playing at 145 BPM. Okay, so what I could also do is just drag and drop this directly onto the pad. And because it has tempo information, as long as I have the follow tempo option over here, you can go all notes off to stop that, then it's going to follow. So if I change the tempo, that will follow as well. Now, in terms of what we want, in terms of the trigger, I can change it from a one shot to a loop to a normal. I can set my in points and out points, just kind of everything that you would expect to be able to do. And it's also very similar to the way that the other samplers work. Kind of like once you learn one or once you understand it, you have a good understanding of how all of them work. Now, also notice here, when we click loop, that we have this indication, this status bar. So as I play this, if I hold it down, it's going to hold. The other thing that I can do is I can choose toggle. I'm going to go all notes off for a second. So that allows you to push it just once if you wanted to do that. Now, in terms of the quantized value, this really comes into play for live performance. So for example, if I wanted to be recording something live on the fly, I could have this set to bars, beats, half beats, or quarter beats. And what that means is that as I'm playing, if I was to push this and I was 3/4 of the way through a bar and I was to trigger a different loop, then it wouldn't start playing until it hit the next bar boundary. And this is, of course, all relative to the tempo that you're working with and relative to where your transport is sitting. So in terms of working with this, it's a very easy system to use. If I wanted to adjust anything, I could just zoom in a bit here. We'll go to the leftmost point and actually, maybe I'll zoom in even a little bit further. And I could try to bring this right in on this downbeat over here at the zero crossing. Okay, I'm going to go all notes off here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to speed it up to like 160. Okay, now watch what happens. Again, we have toggle on. So this is going to follow any tempo changes that you make as long as the loop or the file has any tempo metadata information that's embedded within it. Now, the other thing we could do over here is, for example, let's drag in this one to this section. And again, we want to engage follow tempo. And maybe I want both of these set to be the same choke group. One other tip that I want to give is, let's say that you want to select a pad, but you don't want to have it playing when you select it. If you select in between at the very bottom over here, I'm going to hold down the command key or the shift key. If you select it this way, then you can actually select a pad, but without necessarily triggering it. So this can be useful if you're just trying to select a pad because you want to make some changes to maybe the filter cutoff, the pitch, the amp, any of these envelope settings, any settings that are up here. Very, very useful. If you're working and you've chopped up different samples as well, then you can set these to a choke group, which is the exact same as we were talking about for the hi-hats and the toms. So for example, I could hold down shift and I could assign both of these to choke group 3. Now, if I trigger one, okay, so you get the idea. This really comes into play when you're chopping different things up. Now, same rules apply here in terms of being able to chop things up and send it to an Impact XT. We can do that very easily. You could send an entire loop to an Impact XT just by right-clicking it and send to new Impact. We'll let that happen over here. Notice that it's run a transient detection. Notice our choke groups are all set to off. So this is something that you can adjust if you want to. So I could set this to choke 1. The other thing that you could do is, if you don't want to use a choke group per se, you could also assign this to self. So if you have like a kick that has a super long sustain, maybe we'll transpose this down. Maybe I went a little bit too far. Let's bring it up a little bit. If this is set to choke self, then if you re-trigger the sample, it will automatically cut off the previous version, kind of making this like monophonic versus letting the sample ring out and playing overlapping itself. That's just something to keep in mind. But when we do this transient detection now, we have these different points. I'm going to set these all to choke group 1. And also we can set this to follow tempo. This is at 145. Let's bring ourselves down to like 115. So we're changing the tempo. Each one of these will now follow. And keep in mind, because I'm clicking in the bottom, it's not playing. But if I do want it to play, okay, this isn't the greatest example because it is actually just a different kicks. So it's separated them, but we're getting all the same samples. So maybe what we'll do, we'll right click, we'll remove track and instrument. And let's go back to this full kit mix, or maybe we'll try something different. Let's listen to this one. Keep in mind, this is playing slower because we have play at song tempo. If I want to hear it in the original tempo. Okay, so this would be a good example. I'm going to right click and I'm going to go send to new impact. And now this is automatically going to run a transient detection. It's going to chop up these different pieces. We have 8 different banks that this can spread across. So we have a lot of different potential for our chops. And like I said, it's the same thing over here, holding down shift and selecting the top and the top right. I could assign these to a choke group. Now, if you want to have more manual control over things, then another option that we have is we could literally just drag and drop this in, and then I could even just trim this up to exactly what I want it to be. Maybe I just want to have this over here. Let's actually put our song at the same tempo, which is 146. And then I'm going to scoot this back to the very beginning of my song over here. And then we have some options to separate at grid. So I could say, for example, okay, well, I'm going to set my grid to a half note. We're at 146. And then we have the option under event where we can split at grid. And this has created all of these different chops. Now, once we have all these different chops, we can just highlight, select this over here. I can right click And again, from the audio menu, I can send to new impact. So now we have these different chops, and these chops, as opposed to being tiny, these have been just separated at the grid. And then it's the same thing again here. Holding down Shift, I want to set these to a common choke group, something like here. And then anything that I select is going to get sampled and triggered. And if I was using my impact, or rather my atom, then I can trigger it from here. So depending how you want to work, you can do whatever you want, different styles of sampling. Now, if you just wanted to build a basic drum kit that you could sequence drums on, we have our original example over here. I'm going to actually replace this. I really like some of these Lindrum samples that we have. Let me type in Lin. Okay, and what do we have? We have a kick. I'm going to play it. Okay, so either one of those sounds pretty good to me. I'm going to drag kick 1 over top of this and notice that it just says replace sample. I'll probably have to adjust the actual volume so I can adjust the gain here. And then I'm going to grab a snare. And again, we're going to make sure that's playing. Okay, I like this snare 1 sound over here. And keep in mind, these are one shots, so they don't have any tempo information. Again, I can drag this snare over to here. What we can do in Studio One now is we can create a pattern part, and this, like I said, is very, very similar to the way that Logic works with their sequencer style regions. So there's a shortcut, and it is based on the loop selection that you have over here, whatever you have set. So if we hold down Option and we double click, it will instantly create a step sequencer style pattern part, which is what they're called in Studio One terminology. Now, this is very, very similar. You can set your steps for the actual pattern. So this is 16 steps and we're in 4/4 time. So this would be a 1-bar pattern. Or you could go to, for example, 32 steps. And then each of these lanes can have an individual amount of steps if you wanted one to be twice as long. So essentially you'd be changing the looping section. And then each one of these also has a grid. So from here, it's very easy to program. I'm going to change this back to somewhere around 115. And you know what? Let's just get rid of this track for now. And this one, I don't need it either. But what I do want to do is let's bring back some of our audio. I think the audio file was called aux1. Yeah, we'll bring that back. This is the file that we printed, just so we have some music that we can reference. I'm going to reactivate this track. And now we have some instrumental. Okay, so the way that patterns work is they're basically, regardless of the amount of steps that you have, let's actually just go back to 16 steps. Regardless of the amount of steps that you have, they're infinitely available to drag out as long as you need them to be. So this can be really, really useful. And then we also have the ability to add different variations, and it's super quick and easy to work this way. So we'll start off by doing something. We can just pencil them in just by clicking any one of these, right? We can add in anything on these different parts. And like I said, this is based on a 16 steps and a 16th note grid, which makes it very easy. Another thing that we can do is by holding Shift at the corner, we can also extend this and we can tie this note. And this really comes into play when we start using things like repeats. But for now, we also have some other shortcuts where we can do, for example, every second step. We can do every fourth step. We can do fill the lane. We can clear the lane, and then we can shift everything over. So what I might want to do for this is just something where I'm just dialing in some eighth notes. Now notice also we have these velocity, repeat, delay, and probability tabs. If we go back to Logic for a moment, this is actually very similar to the way that they have the velocity over here. They have the note repeat, and then if you click plus, they have gate, and then if you click it again, they have tie, which is what we did with the Shift key. And then if you click it one more time, so we have note over here. So this is very similar, especially if you're used to working in Logic, then this should be really, really easy to kind of become adjusted to. Now, I can do things like adjust my velocity, and then based on the lane that I've selected, I could use my duplicate commands to duplicate things out very, very easily. The other thing that I could do is I could just drag everything across here. Notice the velocities are remembered. If I want to make adjustments to these velocities, if I hold down Shift, it will basically zero everything out and make them adjust together. Whereas the other thing that I could do is I could come in here individually and adjust my offbeats like this. And then by holding down the Alter option, now it's moving everything, but it's relative to each other. So once you kind of have a grasp and understanding of these basic, foundational elements, then it becomes very easy to work with the step sequencer. The other thing I can do is, based on the pattern part, I can change the amount of steps, which will obviously change the way that this is playing back. So this is 16, I could change to 8. And now notice that we've gone to the 8th note resolution, but 16 steps. Once you kind of familiarize yourself with these rules, it becomes very, very easy. I'm going to just take this out for now. We'll select this and we'll choose every second. So we're doing 8th notes, and I just want to come in manually and I want to draw in a different velocity. And then also I'm going to hold down the Alter option key to just move the velocity up overall. So let's have a listen. Let's take it out of solo. Okay, so I want another kick here. Whoops, here. Okay, now, like I said, once this pattern part is dialed in and you have something in the pattern part, this, I can drag this out as long as I need it to be. So let's have it be about a 4-bar part, and then we can make some different variations as well if we need to. Okay, I'm gonna add an open hat here. Maybe I'll just take this out and put it here. And the other thing is, because we have a choke group, I wouldn't even need to remove this one. So here's another thing I want to do. I can just duplicate this pattern part, and then this will automatically become like a ghosted copy of this. Now from here, I can actually just duplicate this variation, or I can create a new one entirely. But if I click duplicate variation, it's going to give me variation 2, which basically uses the variation 1 as the starting point. And then from here, we could add something different. Okay, that's a little bit loud, so we can either open up this and adjust the amp volume. Maybe I want to add a clap in here as well. And another way that I could have done that is by selecting the lane, right click, I can copy, whoops, I want to copy the actual lane. So that is copy lane, and then I could come to the clap. At the bottom, we have paste, and now I've just pasted that. So this is useful if, for example, maybe you're working with a different, you've dragged in a different cell to a different pad, and you basically want to use what you had as a starting point, and you have the velocities dialed in perfectly. You can just copy the lane and paste it. Okay, now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to duplicate this out a couple more times, and then notice within each one of these regions, which are basically pattern parts, I have the option to choose between these different variations. So maybe for this one, I want it to go back to variation 1. And for this one, maybe I want to have an even more busier version. So again, I'm going to duplicate this variation. This brings me to variation 3. Okay, I want to add some toms. I want to do like... Now the other thing that we can do is we can record directly into these pattern parts. So what that's good for is if you have either a MIDI controller of any sort, or if you're working, in my case, like I'm working with the Atom SQ, I'm just going to record enable this. Now I have the ability to basically enable a pre-count, and then if I wanted to add any of these other elements, okay, let's have a listen. Actually, what I want to do is I'm going to select this. It's a 1-bar pattern, but let's loop it for 4 bars and we'll activate that loop. Actually, technically speaking, I could probably even just bring it to here. Now, you know what? I'll leave it to the full 4 bars. Okay, so if I wanted to record anything into this directly, as long as the focus is within the pattern part editor, then that's something I can do just by making sure this is in focus and engage and record. Now, when you record directly in and you're using a MIDI controller or something like the Atom, I had this set to full volume, so the velocities that you're actually performing will be reflected. But keep in mind, like we learned, we can adjust each one of these velocities just by clicking and dragging. Now, the repeat function, this is something else that we can do. Remember, I mentioned if you hold down Shift that we have the ability to adjust basically the tie length. We also have a repeat function. It works slightly different. In Logic, the number that it says is the amount of repeats that are there. With respect to Studio One, if you add a repeat, it just basically means that it's going to repeat this on top of that. So if we listen to this, so we have 1 repeat, 16th note grid, so we're getting 2 notes. If I go to 2 repeats, changes it to a triplet, 3, and based on the length of your tie, you could tie this across 3 16th note steps or 4 16th note steps, whatever you want. So just something to be aware of, and like I said, holding down the Shift key, and you can also see it updating and adjusting here in real time. So maybe for this, I just want 1 repeat. Or maybe I want nothing at all. So working with the pattern parts is a really great way to flesh out your ideas. And like I say, when you just duplicate these different pattern parts, which in Logic terminology, we'd see them as regions, all you have to do to choose different variations is basically just choose which variation you want. And not only do you have to do things like, for example, create brand new parts, but you could take, for example, your busiest variation, and then if you wanted to take variation 3 and duplicate that into variation 4, you could basically flesh out the whole idea in variation 1, and then you could basically just duplicate that and then just mute or solo different elements. So now variation 4, if I go from variation 3 into variation 4, this is basically just going to solo out the kick. And each one of these can be a different size, depending on whatever you need. Or maybe you want to do something where you're muting something instead of soloing something. Take my click off. So once you get the idea of how to work with these, it's actually pretty powerful. Then of course we can delete variation, or you can add a brand new variation. If you wanted to start something from scratch, add a brand new variation. We have now variation 5, which is a clean slate, or I can remove it this way. One other thing to mention is based on the event or the region that you have selected, if you wanted to change it, there's 2 ways to do it. We can either select this drop-down menu and we can do it that way, or notice this little checkered pattern over here. Based on which event is selected in the arrange window, you can basically just update it by clicking here. Now, pattern parts are great. The other thing that we can do is we can adjust the swing. Be a little bit more audible if we had 16th notes. We can adjust the resolution, we can adjust the steps, we can adjust the accents. Accents are a great way. Let's say that I have something like, let's just use a tom right over here. I'm going to mute these for a second. I'm going to bring the swing down. If you wanted to accent these hits, because your default velocity that gets entered in is somewhere around like 80%. So we have I have mine set in Studio One. We can go by percentage or we can go by MIDI. My default velocities are all coming in at 76, but if you wanted to change that, but you didn't want to necessarily come in and dial each one of these second ones down, you could use this as a starting point, and then you could accent some of these hits. So the way that you accent a hit is by holding Command on a Mac or Control on a PC. When you accent a hit, it basically just makes it a little bit louder. So if we take a look at this, notice we have this like shading with this slightly different color of blue, which is basically just adding a percentage value to the actual velocity that's being entered. And that is adjustable over here. So by default, it is set to 30%, and there isn't any way at this time to change that. But let's say you just wanted it to be 20. So these are a bunch of different ways that you can work with pattern parts. And like I say, especially if you're used to using the step sequencer regions within Logic, then these will be really just a really awesome tool to be able to use, and you should grasp onto it right away. The only major difference I'd say is, as opposed to where Logic has these little drop-down menus where you continuously click the plus icon to show new different options for each one of these lanes. In Studio One, you basically, based on the lane that you've selected and the variation that you're in, you have velocity, you have repeat, you have delay, which you can set a percentage of these. So if I wanted to mute this and open these up for a moment. Let's say I wanted to give all of these a slightly different feel. I'm going to hold down the shift modifier to give myself a bit of fine resolution. We can just make them a little bit later in time. And this is done by percentage. You could also go the other way if you wanted a rushed feel. And then a right click, and we can actually reset all of them. So other than that, probability. If we wanted to adjust the probability of some of these hits, this is especially useful if you have things, for example, where you might have something like, in this case, on this lane, maybe you have it repeating and it's a triplet or a quadruplet. Maybe you don't want it to happen all the time. You could come to the probability and say, like, I only want that to happen like 19% of the time. Now, once you're done working with this and you've dialed in your swing, you've dialed in your gate amount, your accents, you've got everything working, you have a full entire arrangement that you want to work with, two ways that we can basically transfer this to traditional MIDI. The first way would be to select them all and just click the G key, glue them all together. Now you have traditional MIDI. The other way that you can do it is you could just do them one at a time. If you wanted to maintain the individual regions or the individual parts, then we could do that like this. But one tip that I have is, if you're not sure and you might want to go back and revisit it, just create a blank instrument track. We can highlight all of these, Alt-R option to drag them down, and these have now maintained the different variations and everything. They're just not linked to an instrument. And then at that point, once I'm done this, at that point I would then use the options to glue each one of these together, and at least I'd have a backup of my pattern part if ever I wanted to move on and go back or revisit something. But it is a little bit easier, in my mind at least, to edit in a drum MIDI view versus the pattern parts, or at least I want to finalize my song in that way. Anyways, that's all the time I have available for today. I hope that you enjoyed this video. We're going to dive into some more, but for now, I think these two last videos should be a lot to get you going with working with samplers in Logic Pro, or rather, working with samplers in Studio One coming from Logic Pro. So I'll catch you for more in the next video. Cheers.